My name is Liz Romero. I'm one of the members of the Hub team, and I am sitting in today for Dr. Katzman, who is normally our very awesome MC. He's not here with us today, so I'm going to introduce our speaker today and try to moderate as best I can. It's great to see everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. It's always wonderful to see you. Can everyone hear okay? We're good? Thumbs up. Awesome. Thank you. All right, we have a really great presentation today. I'm super excited to hear it. And I'm looking around for our esteemed guest. Let's see, Paige, is she on the next page? Oh, there she is. Hi, thank you so much for being here. It's so funny on Zoom when you're trying to find like one person and you're looking around at all the boxes. But anyway, I want to introduce Dr. Linda, and please pardon if I totally mispronounce and correct my pronunciation. Tuiwai? Is that good? Okay, Smith, who is with us today. Just a brief bio on her. She is known as the mother of Indigenous studies. She wrote a book called Decolonizing Methodologies, Research and Indigenous Peoples, and is considered a very influential text on Indigenous research. I actually did look on YouTube and saw a little bit of your lectures, so I'm really excited to hear you today. Now help me again with pronunciation. Maori, how am I saying that correctly? Okay, great. I was trying to work on this also with the help of YouTube. So today she is going to speak to us about trauma, and without further ado, because I want to give her as much time to talk with us, because I know that you do need to leave a few minutes early. So let's give you as much time with us as possible. I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thank you. I'm just going to share my screen. That didn't work. Let me see. So good morning from New Zealand, and I guess it's afternoon for where many of you are. And I just want to begin by acknowledging all the work that you do, and the need really for us as communities, different kinds of communities, to connect and engage. And even though Zoom might seem a virtual and digital place to do that, in the absence of being able to meet face to face and in real life, I think this is the best thing that we can do. And it's important just to acknowledge each other, and for me to address you on your lands and to bring you greetings from my land, and to hope that you're well, you're keeping yourselves well, you're talking about being well, and the work that you do, I know, is really important. And so what I'm going to do today is really talk about the work that I do in the Indigenous kind of people's space. And in the last few years, I've been engaged in a number of research projects around healing from intergenerational historic trauma, or trauma, as some people might say. And I want to take you through some of the principles that we've come to with the help of our communities that I think are helpful for all of us. So let me just do the screen share again, because when I last did it, it didn't work. I know there's a backup in the system. So open, and then I've got to share my screen. Okay. So firstly, greetings to you from where I'm from. This is my land and territory, my tribal lands, and the fence is the boundary of my family's sheep and cattle farm. And it's about 1,000 hectares on the east coast of New Zealand. a long way from a nearest city. And one of the places where during our COVID lockdown, our tribal members put up checkpoints in the road to the main highways that came into our territory. I'm going to talk a little bit about why they did that shortly, but I just want to greet the lands that you're all from. And it's really important from an Indigenous perspective that we're not just humans, extra special, wonderful creatures. We are part and parcel of the universe, part and parcel of the environment, and we're just one living entity. We're not exceptional as humans, that we have responsibilities to nature, to water, to mountains, and they have their own agency. They also exist as entities. And that sort of philosophy is called relational, that in the Indigenous world, we have this kind of relational way of being and knowing. So a little bit more about me. I'm Māori. That's the name for the Indigenous peoples of New Zealand. And I come from 3 different tribal communities. We claim descent equally from our parents, and we have the ability to belong to and be considered members of all those tribes that we have genealogies to, which is slightly different from what happens in North America. I'm a grandmother, and I'm a mother, a sister, a daughter, and lastly, I'm a wife. It's not that my husband comes last, but my role as a woman in my communities is really, really important. And traditionally, women were seen, the Māori name for what we do is whare tangata. We are the house of people. Women are the house of people because we have a womb and we give birth. I'm also a writer of short stories and children's stories and poetry, and I draw cartoons, although they get me into trouble sometimes because they're very political. And my children's stories address issues of trauma as well. So I've been trying to write children's stories from a child's perspective about the big issues in trauma that they too have to live with and have to understand, but there's very little literature for children that talks frankly about things like suicide, depression, abandonment, abuse, domestic violence, those sorts of issues. So I have 5 stories that are about to be published. I'm a really terrible cook, but I love eating. And I'm quite proud of being a terrible cook because I can do other things that I'm quite good at. And then my sisters are awesome cooks. So why have 3 in a family who are great cooks and then you fight over the kitchen? It's much better for me to sit at the table and wait for the food to be delivered. And these feet that you see belong to my daughter and my grandson. And I took those many years ago because my grandson is now 18 and he's just finished secondary school. It's been the worst final year for him as a secondary school student because everything that was going to be enjoyable this year got cancelled because of the pandemic. And then you will notice in my spelling, I do have some spelling errors, but generally speaking, I spell New Zealand style. So I want to begin by honouring those who've passed, who've died during this time of the pandemic of COVID-19. And I want to honour those who love, care and mourn for them, and those who serve across the entire health system, but especially those of you who are in the front line. And I also want to acknowledge those, what we call in New Zealand, essential workers and volunteers who continue to keep our community safe and well. And that means really pausing to honour you and have you honour yourself and your colleagues. So I'm just going to give a few moments for you to actually honour yourself and maybe think about ways you can maybe a wave or honour each other. Okay, this photo is taken of sort of emergency and a new cemetery that was built in Brazil. And one of the things I've been monitoring this year really is the plight of Indigenous peoples around the world and some of the ways in which states and governments have again abandoned Indigenous populations. This is particularly so in some of the countries in Latin America, but also in India, in Southeast Asia. Many of our communities have really taken significant hits just in terms of being abandoned by governments and health systems and left to fend for themselves. And for us, that means left to die. So just a little bit more about my approach to understanding sort of trauma. I accept it's complicated, and in the Indigenous world, we do talk about it as being intergenerational. So I study colonialism and colonisation, particularly of the way in which Indigenous knowledge has been colonised, not just the way people are colonised, and have spent a career seeking ways to decolonise our knowledge systems. I'm interested in the well-being of people as well as the well-being of our knowledge. I see those as linked, that if our knowledge is denigrated, we are denigrated. If what we know is dismissed and ridiculed, we are dismissed and ridiculed. I also carry out research with our communities that are based really on the solutions to addressing intergenerational trauma, and not just describing once again what that trauma looks like and how it's been caused. I mean, there's a lot of work in that space, but that doesn't really make our lives better. What makes our lives better is really trying to focus on those things that work, that help us deal with these issues. And in my most recent study, we got very powerful feedback from communities all over the country to stop talking about trauma, really, trauma-informed care, and really focus on healing and to emphasise and centre concepts of healing. And in the following slides, I'll try and explain what that means. So also want to do some remembering. It's very important in the Indigenous world, not only to honour, but to remember. And a pandemic generally is this worldwide public health event, and it challenges all our systems. And I think all of us all over the world have seen how our systems come under enormous stress and sometimes fracture in the context of a pandemic. They might work reasonably well under normal conditions, but in a pandemic, often what gets exposed, and this pandemic has done it all around the world, is the huge inequities and inequalities in society, the fragility of systems, the stress and strain that's already in some of our, whether it's health or social service systems, the dependency of our economy on basically poor people and their labour to sustain what essential work that keeps a community alive. They do all the dirty work that keeps rich countries rich. So Indigenous peoples have faced, we've got memories of numerous epidemics and pandemics, and our memories of these in the context of also colonisation, the loss of our sovereignty, land loss, and significant attempts that have been made to destroy Indigenous peoples and their languages and cultures. So trauma has a way of being remembered, or what I also talk about is remembered in terms of our bodies, our body parts, and our belonging to something whole. And trauma's remembered across generations. The issue for me often is people focus on the trauma that's remembered across generations and not the survival and healing experiences that also need to be remembered across generations. That it's really important to remember what made us resilient. It's important to remember the strategies that in the end we used, our ancestors used, to keep ourselves surviving at the very least, but also to protect our communities, because that remembering is just as important as remembering the events that were traumatic. So one of the values that we hold dear is that we all have ancestors. Everyone has ancestors. And, you know, even though some of them may not have been very nice, I think it's really important to remember the cool ones, the best of our ancestors, and strive to be the best ancestor ourselves. So the importance of this is not just ancestors live in the past, but each and every one of us is an ancestor in the making. And I think we have an obligation to try and be a real cool ancestor. You know, try to do our best to be the best of ourselves, because that's who we want our grandchildren and great-grandchildren to remember. Also, remember that our ancestors live within us and through us. We don't necessarily need to go looking for them externally or in a museum. We are them. We're the living embodiment of all our ancestors. And that means we have a unique identity that we need to see as special and worthy. And our ancestors left us songs to sing. And sometimes we need to remember those songs and we need to sing them because they make us feel good and they remind us how we're connected to the past. Everything we provide is medicine, so we have to make sure it heals. So these are some of the principles that have come out of this research. And the communities who said this to us were basically describing what it means to go to a clinic or a social service provider or an organisation and then made to feel not welcome at the door, not welcome at the reception, not welcome in the waiting room. And that's before they even get to see the clinician or the therapist or the counsellor. So their message to us was that whatever we do in this space, whether it's in health or education or social service, everything we do and everything that everyone employed in these systems does is medicine, needs to be considered as medicine. And that means it needs to be healing. So, you know, it's not just the clinician, it's the person who answers the phone, the person who makes appointments and sends out reminders. It's the pharmacist who gives out medicines. It's the posters on the wall, magazines and brochures. And it's also the researcher and the community-based practitioner and the health policy analyst. Everyone involved in a health system needs to be focused on healing from our point of view. And often we take for granted that, you know, the healing specialists are the nurses, the doctors, the therapists, the clinicians, even the Indigenous knowledge specialists. But through our research, what our participants said is the receptionist, the person who files the filing, our case notes, the researcher, the policy analyst, these people also need to be seen as healers, they need to dedicate their work to healing. Oh, that photograph is of my son-in-law and 2 grandsons involved in the revitalization of ocean-going waka, or the ancient Polynesian canoes that sailed the Pacific. And revitalizing our culture has been an important part of our healing journey, because we can't do any of these activities without intergenerational engagement. And that's been very important for us as a community. Help a person to heal themselves. This was another principle from our research, that there's, that sort of point where those of us who are professionals have to do what we do, but we have to kind of also empower the individual and the family concerned to carry on the healing work. What often happens in our communities is, when the expert, if you like, is out of the room or out of sight, they lapse back into maybe some of the behaviours and practices that were not helpful to them in the first place. So the real challenge is, how do we, in our work, also give tools to people to continue on their healing journey. So in our words, we put this all metaphorically. So helping a person to heal themselves internally and intergenerationally. Sing them their songs so they can hear their ancestors. Wrap their stories around them so they can find meanings in their lives. Open the doors so they can find their own pathways to healing. Help them mourn and farewell trauma. Offer them ceremony to welcome them back to well-being. So we're not very good often at putting in place ceremonies for the various phases of becoming well. And we're particularly not good at the ceremonies for farewelling trauma. We often forget to do that because we think, okay, it's gone, goodbye, no loss. But for many people who've suffered a trauma, that is, in a spiritual sense, psychological sense, quite an important moment that needs to be acknowledged through some kind of ceremony. Because what ceremonies do is, in a symbolic way, acknowledge a transition in somebody's life. And it gives them a point in time and some sort of practices that sort of cement that they're farewelling something that they don't need anymore in their lives. And it means that in a ceremonial sense, they can open themselves up to something new. Help them rebuild their own house of support so they have shelter. So this is not just about homelessness and actually having a house, actually having a roof over your head. This is also about building or giving people tools to build the support systems that for various reasons are no longer around them. Some of those reasons, as you know, that individuals themselves have destroyed those support systems. Their families don't want them back. They have been destructive. They have been abusive. They've been violent. They've been hurtful. And so going to some idea of home and family is not realistic. But even for those people, they need support. They need support so they do no harm to anyone else, and they need support so they themselves can become well. So that in our context, it's about reconnecting them often to their Indigenous culture, and we have a lot of programs in New Zealand that do that. Helping them restore relationships or to build new relationships. Co-constructing their case notes so they can narrate their own story. this was a really important finding in our research, that people felt powerless even in the way their story was told. And then they got paranoid about what was written about them, because they never really saw what was there. And then they started to interpret the world as if everyone knew what was written, but they didn't. So this is all about transparency, but also about rebuilding people's confidence to tell their own story, and then standing aside when they're ready to depart. As you know, some people like to depart early and some people like to depart late. And when you've been in the business of, community-based practice in particular, but I'm sure many of you have similar experiences, some people do leave too early and they fall flat on their faces, and they need to come back. Other people are terrified to leave. And so the whole process of departing, the whole process of what's called moving on, although it's not a term we like to use, is also a sort of ceremonial process that really takes people through quite a powerful symbolic journey, not just a sort of material journey or physical journey. All right, so I'm sorry I've kind of whipped through some of these principles, but hopefully we can have a discussion. All of this comes out of a significant research program I've been part of, which is on Māori approaches to trauma-informed care. And the word in Māori for trauma is related to our body, and the term is patu ngākau, the hurting, the beating of our well-being. And so the term for well-being then is this idea of oranga ngākau, the well-being of our ngākau. So for us, our ngākau is actually, if you were to locate it physically in the body, it would be like in our spleen, in our liver. Those parts of our body are considered the most important places in which our emotions reside, in our stomach, in our spleen, not in our sort of physical heart and not up here, but in a part of our body that in our gut, for example, that's where these emotions sit. And so we have a lot of language that talks about, if you're angry, the word in our language for being angry is your stomach is angry. So all of this, in other words, is framed in an Indigenous Māori philosophy. So I want to end there and hopefully invite everybody to participate in talking.
Wow, that was amazing. Thank you so much. Gosh, so much that I want to expand on, so many things I want to ask you. Really just terrific, amazing talk. I do want to throw it out to the group while we still have you, just to open up for questions right now.
Hello, thank you so much. I'm curious about the switching of framework or mindset from healing to drama, from trauma to healing. We've been talking about, trauma informed, and I really like just let's go straight to healing. So if you could just tell us a little bit more about that. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, we've sort of adopted the trauma and informed care model here in New Zealand. It came in partly from North America, but also from the United Kingdom. And one of the difficulties of adopting these frameworks from other places is they don't naturally kind of resonate, and people have had to get their heads around what it means. But there's strong resistance in our communities to programs that are seen as continuing to victimize us or continuing to reinforce the trauma aspects and are inadequate in the healing aspects, like don't pay attention to the cultural wealth that we ourselves can contribute to our own healing. You know, so a lot of the trauma-informed care models take for granted the kind of interventions, health interventions, well-being interventions, which are all Western designed. Whereas we have our own health interventions, which we would like to see supported and empowered. And we would argue, our communities would argue that, you know, in the end, our people have to flourish in our families and in our communities. And in order for them to flourish, you know, everything has to resonate and sit well in that context. Otherwise, you can give an individual, you know, interventions, and then they go home to the very environment, you know, that it doesn't suit them. So that's partly why this emphasis on shift towards focusing more on the healing aspect. They're not ignoring the trauma and what has caused that trauma and the fact that trauma exists. But what they're saying is it's not enough just to talk about that. And don't come and talk to us about trauma if you don't have some healing strategies you can share.
Hi there. Can you talk a little bit? I was really interested in the part of the farewell to the to trauma. Can you talk a little bit more about that, please?
Well, interesting, isn't it? I mean, we, in our culture, and I'm sure in other cultures, we have many ceremonies. You can live your entire day through lots of different sorts of ceremonies. They're not necessarily elaborate. They might be a little, what we might call a prayer that just acknowledges we're moving from one phase of our day and being to another phase. The thing with the farewelling trauma, I guess it's a little bit by, you know, similar to if you have a limb cut off, you know, just because the limb is gone doesn't mean you say don't miss it. And for many of our participants, they sort of wanted to, so one of the things ceremony does, it's for you as an individual, but it's also a public acknowledgement that something has now been put aside. It's now gone. And there's a process, and some of these processes are new. Some of them are actually very ancient for putting something aside. It might be kind of figuratively burying it. It might be burning it and letting the ashes fly into the sky. It might be purifying it through a purifying type ceremony. But basically, it's to acknowledge that this weight that was bearing down on you has now been lifted and you're free. And hopefully, if it's a good ceremony, it never comes back again to haunt you.
Other questions out there? There's a couple of things in the chat. Let's see. This last comment just sounds also a lot like practicing forgiveness.
There's a lot of forgiveness in healing. Mostly forgiving yourself. But there's also giving, not just forgiving, but giving. giving to yourself, giving to others, that in giving is healing. So it's not just forgiving, but giving. Because we are in relation, we are by nature, human beings are social. And, you know, much of our well-being is how we live together, how we care for each other, as well as how we care for other living entities, our environment, our waterways, our mountains, our animals, those sorts of things that in order to get, you must give. That's putting it pretty brutally.
Let's see, there's another question in the chat. Also, how do you deal with the shame of trauma?
Yeah. You deal with it by addressing it. And I think not continuing to victimize people. I mean, I love working with our community providers, and my research over the last 10 years has been in partnership with them, because they go on these very long journeys with their clients. You know, they never abandon them, because you can't in the community. You know, you can't pretend you don't see them suffering, because they're there visible in communities, or they're invisible, which means they're in trouble. So I just, you know, part of it is the terms that are often used in the way we talk about some issues continues to victimize people. So we have victim, and then we also have perpetrator, for example, if someone caused somebody else to be a victim. Neither of those terms are helpful when you're thinking about healing, because in the end, you want to take them from those positions to a place of where they're not identified by being a victim, because that's not a healthy identity. And it's not a good identity to be a perpetrator. There has to be more to people than that. And if they have committed a crime, well, obviously there's a whole process in the criminal justice system that deals with that. But when they come out of that system, and a lot of research also shows this, you know, you get to know these individuals, they too are often victims. You know, this is true in our domestic violence area, which is where I'm working at the moment, is often, you know, these words that are binary, they create these binary relationships that are not helpful. These are complicated relationships in which, especially when you're thinking about family violence or domestic violence, we can't solve them by just getting rid of all the men. Because what happens in our community is all the research shows that Indigenous women will take the man back. All right. So even though all the police will remove him and do all sorts of things, he'll go to jail, he'll come out of jail and do whatever he needs to, you know, pretend and make out he's reformed, and the woman will take him back, and that she will continue to take him back until often the children are grown up, or some of them sort of have a number, like continue for like 30 times when she's nearly dead, twice before she'll kick him out. And so if that's what's happening in our communities, sort of enabling the man to just leave won't change the situation. And so what a lot of our providers do is they've got to work with the men, the women, the children, the extended family, and the community, that everyone implicated in it is a victim and an enabler and a perpetrator, and the whole, what we call the whānau or extended family, is actually the unit that needs healing. Sorry, that's a complicated answer.
I think it's such an important answer, though, the non-binary nature. I love that you introduced that concept, because we do like to put things into these very sort of binary, neat boxes as a way of understanding, but it is so much more complex than that. And by not recognizing that complexity, I think we completely sort of miss the boat, right? We miss the idea of how to actually address these problems. I wonder if you could elaborate a little more kind of on how you've addressed that within your community, within your culture.
We have very strong organizations. They're often non-government organizations, what we call community-based organizations. They may have government contracts, but they're essentially staffed and created by people from those communities. And in the same way, I can talk about non-binary sort of relationships in relation to, say, domestic violence. The wonderful thing about our community organisations is they also don't separate out, well, this is an economic issue, so that organisation should deal with the economic stuff. We'll deal with psychological issues, and another organisation will deal with child poverty, and another one will deal with health. That sort of fragmented nature of service delivery is really unhelpful, because it all becomes about the providers and their contracts. It doesn't in the end be about the community and the families. And what happens, and there's now a big government program to prevent this, is in some of our most vulnerable households and communities, every government agency under the sun is in there. It's like front door, back door, coming in the back windows, through the side door. And when that happens, they just give up. They just like sit there and watch. They are completely disengaged. And so there's a big program now to stop that multi-agency overwhelming of a family and a household, so that there becomes a principal agency that deals with all matters, that it's coordinated. Because in the end, and this is true of Indigenous peoples all over the world, is states and governments have completely disempowered our most fundamental social responsibilities, our social relationships, and our sovereignty of our bodies, of our minds, of what we know, of our mother-child relationships, of what happens in our homes, that governments have intervened in those. I mean, whether it's in North America, Australia, or New Zealand, disproportionately high numbers of Māori children, Indigenous babies, are removed by the state. The figures are stark, and I'm sure it's true in the United States as well, that our children are taken away. And when that happens, a number of significant things happen. Their bond to their identity is removed. Their sort of mother-child relationships, their access to their grandparents, their access to their community, to their language, all of that is destroyed. And we've got so many examples of people trying to rebuild an identity that the state has destroyed. And so when we're talking about the healing part, that's all really part of it. It's not a particular issue. It's this whole context. It's why it's intergenerational, is we have to rebuild, revitalize the essence of their identity. That's why it's important to tell them they've got fabulous ancestors, because even their ancestry has been denied. It's why it's important to tell them, they've got songs that are about them. They have a mountain in our culture. Everyone has a mountain, and that mountain is the biggest mountain in the world. Everyone has a river or a waterway, and that waterway is the most special waterway in the world. That individuals are not alone. You know, we're not alone. And we have to kind of reinforce the importance that not only are we not alone, but we, in order to live, we have to care for others. We have to be responsible. We have to be accountable. It comes with belonging.
Right, that interconnectedness, and a few comments in the chat I want to go back to. People just talking about how COVID has really disrupted that interconnectedness, because we have to, physically be distant from each other. And then there was another question in the chat about going back to forgiveness. Why forgive myself when I did not ask for the colonizers to come to my land and kill and abuse my people and remove our language? Could you please talk about what you said about forgive ourselves?
Yeah. Well, that's true. There are things that we're not agents of in terms of what has happened to Indigenous peoples. But often, what does happen internally is that we continue to colonize ourselves. We practice what's often called lateral kind of colonialism or lateral violence to ourselves. We kind of perpetrate colonization. And so it is important to kind of politically understand what that is, because that's not what I'm saying we have to forgive ourselves for. But I think, part of living to me is this concept, firstly, of giving, and then also understanding that in the course of a day, we give, but we also forgive. In other words, we affirm our identity. We strengthen and enhance ourselves. We think about and reflect on those things that we did today, which were really fabulous and constructive, and then those things that we can give ourselves a sort of need to do better report. So, I accept the point that colonization happened to us, but we now are in a position, I think, where we can't just say, well, because we're colonized, we can't act. I mean, I think the story of Māori in New Zealand is we will never give up. We'll never give up fighting for what we think is ours. We will continue to do that. And in order to do that, we have to kind of remember the divisive role that colonization has played on our communities. So in order to continue to struggle forward, we have to bring our people with us. And that's hard.
Other questions, other comments?
I just want to make a comment. I saw something about physical distancing, under COVID conditions. And, that is true. But I think one of the amazing things that I've noticed is for us under lockdown, it was really important to reach out. And those of us who had access to the technology really had a responsibility to keep reaching out and keep connecting. And that's one of the wonderful things that many of our tribes did, is they knew where everybody lived. And so those who were seen as essential workers, they were busy during lockdown. They were busy delivering food. They were busy monitoring, standing outside somebody's gate and just checking up on them. They were busy in terms of ensuring people were connected. And, my father he's 93 years old. My sister moved in with him during our lockdown to make sure that he was fine. And as a family, we live all over New Zealand, but we had regular wine o'clocks, we called them, which is a Zoom meeting at about 5 o'clock in the afternoon. And everyone came with their glass of their favorite liquid. And we would just sometimes just look at each other and smile and, see how the children were. The teenagers all participated. Our young nephews who, they're in their 20s, they would probably be rather doing everything but participate in a family gathering. But we did that at least once a week. Since we've not been in lockdown, we've stopped doing it. And, one of my sisters said, we really need to carry on doing this weekly family gathering online, because it was fantastic. And sometimes we didn't really have much to say to each other. We just liked looking at each other's faces. We tried to sing a song together. It was appalling. I don't know if you've ever tried to sing with anyone on Zoom, but really you just have to mute yourselves and then sing, because unless you're a professional opera singer or choir singer, it doesn't work. We tried telling each other stories and jokes and all sorts of things, but what COVID has forced us to do is to be more proactive in the way we reach out, to be more deliberate, to think more about mental health and well-being, to check up more, and those are good things. Those are things we should have been doing anyway, and we forgot. And I think we need to just be purposeful about that going forward.
I've just been riveted this whole time. So honestly, I'm supposed to be moderating, and I'm having a hard time doing it because I'm just I'm just riveted by what you're saying. It's so important.
So I'm going to have to go now, Elizabeth.
Absolutely. We appreciate you being here. It was an absolute pleasure to have you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone, and look after yourselves and your families. And we're really hoping that, your election stuff gets sorted. Love to you all.
Thank you.
Yes, so do we.
All right. I love that. Yeah, we're really hoping as well. So I made the, on the fly decision to not do listening groups because I was just, like I said, captivated by what she was saying. And I really wanted to get as much time as we could. So I apologize for a bit of the awkward moderating. We have just a few minutes left. Anyone who didn't get a chance to make a comment, who wants to make a comment, I can just open it up for now for that. I thought that was just such a great talk.
I'm Karen. I just want to say, due to the nature of my work, I wasn't able to log on until just now, so it sounds like I missed a fabulous presentation. Is it recorded by any chance?
Yes.
Oh, go ahead. Yes, it is, and it will be available hopefully within a week or so.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you.
I wanted to make a comment is, you can see that I'm kind of old, but my grandson is Mescalero on the other grandma's side. And he got me into TikTok, indigenous TikTok. And I am so amazed at this community of indigenous TikTokers and how powerful they are, and how even some of these young people were adopted by, majority populations, but went back and reconnect. And a lot of times on there, they talk about reconnecting, where they go back and really learn their language, even though they may not have been exposed to it. And I don't know, I just learned so much from native TikTok. And I really, even if you're old like me, want to encourage you, check out TikTok. It's really an amazing platform for community and reconnection, especially for young people and not just Indigenous in America. There's Aboriginal people from Australia, and I'm really kind of blown away at how wonderful and how powerful the organizational and healing aspects of TikTok are. So anyways, that's just a comment of my experience.
That's awesome. I love that. Who would have thought, right? But you never know where you're going to find these things. That's great. Anyone else before we wrap up? Yeah, it seems like everyone really kind of lots of positive comments in the chat, really enjoyed it. Yeah, and then just from Hector, the role of religious beliefs or practices as part of the therapy for others, even maybe part of the problem of intergenerational trauma. So yeah, complex issue, this was just fascinating. Quick reminder, Laura, correct me if I'm wrong, today's the last day of the survey, right? So.
Yeah, just a reminder for those of you who've been with us, today is sorry, my baby just started crying, of course, as soon as I unmuted myself. We really would love your feedback on how these sessions are working for you, and also kind of what we can do in the new year to kind of keep the sessions fresh and current and keep up with what you really need. And so we have a survey that's out right now. You should have received it 2 weeks ago. If you didn't receive it and you would like to, just email us at First Responder Echo, which where reminders, you can just reply to the reminder emails that you get for this session. And today is the last day of the survey. So if you haven't done it yet, it takes less than 10 minutes. We'd really appreciate it if you would give us some feedback on how we can make this session as good as possible for everybody.
Great, thanks, Laura. Now, Paige, Shannon, anyone who can answer this question, are we meeting next week? It's week of Thanksgiving, I know, I wasn't sure.
We are meeting next week. Thank you. That's a great question. We are meeting next week. We will not be meeting the Monday after Thanksgiving. And then we'll have a few weeks off over the winter break as well. So be aware of that. But we will hopefully see you all next week. And Shannon just put that in the chat. Our topic next week will be, where are we now? Reevaluating workforce stress in COVID-19 with Rachel Cowell. So that'll be next Monday. And then we'll be off the week after that.
Rachel's a good friend of mine. She's an awesome presenter, guys. Come and listen to her.
Awesome. Thank you.
Super cool.
Great. Thanks, Kimball. Fantastic. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. It's always terrific to see you. Thank you for all the work that you do. We appreciate you so much. Be well, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you.